Hello, and welcome to a new video series where I'm going to be going through a new 40k Crusade project or new army list along with the results and army list on the table. This is something that I wanted to do for a while, and I thought it might be something that might interest some people, especially those who are considering getting into Crusade for the first time in 9th edition 40k. If you're not familiar with who I am, originally I am the creator and host of a podcast called the Grimdark Podcast. The Grimdark Podcast ran from 2013 through until I think the last episode was during 2018, maybe 2019 actually. Unfortunately, so the podcast itself mainly covered Warhammer 40k RPG. So starting off with the Dark Heresy, Rogue Trader, etc. lines from Fantasy Flight Games. It then moved to covering the Wrath and Glory game by Ulysses Spieler, which then later on moved to Cubicle 7. And unfortunately, a combination of both the production cycle for the game becoming extremely extended, like one book per year type production cycle, and also just my co-host Michael getting a bit busier, the show sort of petered out. So the Grimdark podcast, we've said it's on hiatus, but realistically speaking, we've been planning for a while to make an announcement that the show itself is done. But we'll also be soon announcing a new podcast project that Mike and I were doing called the Dice Mechanics Podcast, which will be more of a generic role playing and general systems podcast talking about our experience with systems. We've both been playing since the 1980s in some capacity, both role playing games and tabletop war games. So we'd like to get together from time to time and chat about our experiences. And the Grimdark podcast certainly had something of a following during its time. I'm also a game writer. I've also been actively involved in 40k since 1988, 1 year after it first came out. That includes having worked at Games Workshop when it first opened in Australia back in the 1990s, uh, and then a long experience with doing the RPGs as well. I sort of dropped out of the 40k war game around third edition, and I came back in again right at the tail end of seventh edition. And myself and my friends have been playing pretty solidly all the way through eighth, and even more solidly through ninth edition as well. Uh, Along with 40k, you can also catch me every week on Saturdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, where I run a Rogue Trader campaign on AP Gaming Reel's Twitch channel, which is then later on broadcast onto YouTube, and also on Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, where I play in AP Gaming Reel's Cyberpunk game. Plus, I'm quite active on that channel's Discord as well. Or alternatively, you can find me on Twitter at GrimdarkJames. So, if you're not familiar with Crusade, Crusade is what narrative play has become since the release of ninth edition 40k. So, previously, narrative play was really just an open rule system which allowed you to basically bring what you had, didn't have to conform to any sort of point structures or the like. Crusade is much more codified, but we've actually found it quite fun. In fact, with my group of friends, since the, 9th edition first came out, we've only actually played one non-Crusade game. And we've played well over 30 Crusade games during the same time as well. So Crusade allows you to build a simple list at the start with only a few units. And then as you play games, you earn points, which you can then use to improve those units. You can use them to add new units to your roster as well. If you're familiar with the old Path of Glory system that was available for both Warhammer Fantasy Battle and then Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and I think also briefly for Warhammer 40k, there was a Path to Glory which allowed you to start with one or two units and go from there. In many ways, Crusade is a bit similar. Probably you need more than a couple of units to get started. So it is, I will say, a cheaper and easier way to start progressively collecting 40k and playing as you do so. Although, as you'll see at the end of this video, it's still not that cheap. It's just cheaper than going straight for a 2,000 point army or the like. There's been plenty of information about how Crusade works on the Warhammer community website, including some examples of play. Funnily enough, I actually watch quite a few different battle report channels like Tabletop Tactics or Striking Scorpion, and there hasn't been a lot of Crusade play that I've seen on YouTube. Most of it's conventional match play. Now, my friends and I don't have good enough painting or good enough studio skills to really record our full Crusade games, but the hope is by bringing together this new video series, you'll get to see some of the highlights of our gaming as well. So what can you expect in the videos in this series? So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating a new Crusade force for the existing Crusade campaign, which I'll explain a bit more about shortly. We'll go through an overview of the Crusade itself or the campaign itself and where the new force will fit in. I'll go take you through how I build the force, so how I do my model selection, and then the process of buying, converting, and obviously painting the miniatures for the force. And then in future videos, I'll also go through how it does on the tabletop and talk about some game highlights as well, potentially get some videos or some photos in there. And as I develop the Crusade force, you get to see how it changes and the new models I bring in over time as well. So I'll tell you a bit about our Crusade campaign. We originally started in August of 2020 after the release of 9th edition of 40k. Overall, 6 people have played in the campaign. I will point out that 2 of them are my 9-year-old son and his best friend. So I don't know if I'd really consider them serious gamers. So let's say there's 4 serious adults playing 40k. And between the group, we have a total of 15 different forces across multiple factions as well. In the last 9 months since 9th edition came out, we've played 37 Crusade games. In many cases, because of the way the power level works, we can actually get through 2 to 3 games in a single sitting as well. Um, we've opted to use power level instead of points. So if you're not that familiar with how that works in Warhammer, many units will have a points cost, which will be, in the tens or 20s or even hundreds of points. And then on top of that, you'll pay points for each additional upgrade you give them. So new weapons, new equipment, new abilities will all cost points as well. Power level is a much more simplified version. Power level is just a single, 1 or 2 digit number that applies to every unit, regardless of how it is equipped. There are a couple of things that will change. For example, adding a jump pack will add 1 power level to a unit. But generally speaking, whether you've got a squad of 5 Devastators carrying bolters or a squad of 5 Devastators carrying las cannons, they have the same power level, although their points are different. We played 8th edition using points all the way through, and some of the players wanted to try power level in 9th edition, and Crusade, the way it was written, seemed to be more conducive to power level play as well. So we opted to go with power level in our campaign. As with a standard Warhammer 40k Crusade game, we started with 50 power level lists, and our original plan was when we started, we would play 25 power level games. So that meant that your initial list didn't need to be a force that could be cohesively put on the table at 50 power level. It just needed to include enough things that could be put cohesively on the table at 25 power level. And then our arrangement was that as we grew our forces, once we hit 100 total power level, we'd all start playing 50 power level games. Once we hit 200, we'd start playing 100 power level games. That's not quite how it's worked out. So at this point in time, only a single Crusade force has gone over the 100 power level. But in most cases, the rest are around the 70 to 80 mark, and we're already playing 50 power level games just because we'd already done all of the 25 power level options that the books had, and the players wanted to try some new things and also have this idea that in a 25 power level game, if things go badly for you, it's often pretty hard to recover because you've lost a lot of your forces in one fell swoop. Last time we got together and played, actually, no, time before that, sorry, when one of our friends was first trying out his Drukhari army, the first game we played literally lasted less than 40 minutes. And so we had time to play a second game, but just some really bad luck on the first term really annihilated them. And when we played a 50 power level game afterwards, we had a lot more fun. It took a lot more time. So, yeah, that's where we've changed to now. I think it'll be a long way before we are doing 100 power level games. If you're not familiar with how power level converts to points, roughly every 25 power level could be called about 500 points. So the 25 power level games we started with will be a 500 point game. The 50 points we're doing now, or 50 power level, would count as a 1,000 point game. And if we ever got up to doing 100 power level, that would be the equivalent of a 2,000 point game, give or take, thereabouts. So I've just put here for your information the existing factions that we've got and the players and how they've done. So today, even before I create this new list I'm working on, I have 5 current Crusade factions in our campaign. My main Crusade faction is my Imperial Fists. The Imperial Fists were an army I started collecting during 8th edition. Previously, or most of the way through my Warhammer experience, my main army was always Ultramarines. I started with that back in the 80s and 90s, and I continued that all the way through to the start of 8th edition. Uh, During 8th edition, at one point I was traveling interstate for work, and I went into a Games Workshop store just to kill some time. And this was the week that both the Salamanders and Imperial Fists codexes had been released for 8th edition to support the second edition of, or the revised Space Marine Codex. And I just wanted something to read while I was staying in a hotel, so I decided to pick up the Salamanders Codex because I liked their aesthetic. And I was actually considering as a project doing an all Primaris army, so only using Primaris models and tanks and the like. And so I thought I was going to do Salamanders. Unfortunately, when I went through the Salamanders book, I found that a lot of what was archetypically Salamanders, like Melter and Flame weapons, didn't have a lot of options in a pure Primaris army. Other than Flamestorm aggressors at the time, there weren't really, I mean, we didn't have eradicators then. We didn't have other units that could use flame weapons or melter weapons. And I really felt like I would be doing the army a disservice to only play Primaris at that point in time in the Salamanders meta. So I actually went back to the Games Workshop store and I also picked up then the Imperial Fists Codex. Now, ironically, a lot of people actually hate painting yellow. At that particular point in time, I had just finished painting a House Hawkshroud army for my Imperial Knights, which is of course a yellow color scheme, which I'd submitted into the Armies on Parade at my local Games Workshop store, and that army had won the Monsters and Machines category for my local Games Workshop store. So I felt like I could now do yellow well enough, and so I decided then that I was going to do an all Primaris Imperial Fist army. And that was my main army through the end of 8th edition, and it was the first Crusade force I played going into 9th, and it's one I played the most with. Uh, it has been pretty good. As you can see here, I've won 60% of my games. I put it down to a couple of good units that have really been successful, like Bolt Storm Aggressors and Assault Centurions. They're probably my two linchpin units that have done the most damage. Um, and I've really enjoyed putting that army together and painting it and getting it up to a level I enjoy putting on the table as well. Uh, I've also been a big player of Sisters of Battle ever since they first came out in metal format. I hadn't really played them during 8th edition until right at the end when they started to bring out plastics because I was sort of over painting and managing metal miniatures. And so the Sororitas I had sort of sat unused until the new plastics came out, but they've seen a lot more use now during 9th edition. As you can see, I've played less games, but I've literally only lost a single game with my Sororitas so far. Certainly, there's been some things I've learned about the way that 9th edition works that my Sororitas army does play well into. I've also tried Necrons. I have had a single game as Dark Angels, which was actually our Crusade campaign's first draw. 9th edition, because of the high scoring points in the game, it's very rare to get an actual draw. And my Dark Angels did draw against my friend Mike's Death Guard army. My Craftworld army actually had lots of losses at the start, but I was going for a particular agenda which allowed me to get lots of XP, and so the army actually got better towards the end, and it started to have some wins now as well. Although its last battle was a draw. Then I've got my friend Mike. Mike, who you would know if you were a fan of the Grimdark podcast, is my co-host. He's brought 3 armies to the table so far: Death Guard, Adeptus Custodes, and Tyranids. Uh, he's really got this focus on hardy, hard to kill units. A lot of his characters have uh, higher invulnerable saves because of upgrades he's got them, higher toughness. He's invested quite heavily into enhancing single units rather than having a variety of units. And I'll talk to that in a moment about how that affects Crusade play as well. But overall, he's spread his love between his 3 different factions, and he's had better than average success with them. So when it comes to the players with the highest wins in our campaign, once I exclude my 9-year-old son who's played 1-1-1, then Mike and I are constantly sort of neck and neck as to who has the highest win percentage across all armies. And right now it's me, but if I lost one or Mike suddenly won one against someone else, that could quickly change again because we're within a few percent of each other. Then we've got our friend Steve. Steve, throughout most of 8th edition, was a Thousand Suns player, and a little bit with Drakari as well. he had always planned to do a World Eaters army and had started collecting berserkers and the like. And so it wasn't really until Crusade first started that he really got that army off the ground. And in fact, his two wins with that force were right at the start of Crusade. He was just doing very well then. The Lord Discordant was a really powerful unit before a lot of other units had their codexes out. And he had some early successes. Unfortunately, that hasn't been duplicated since. He's also brought Chaos Knights, Salamanders, now Drakari and Orcs to the table. And unfortunately, he's not got any wins, although he did get the draw with the Drakari against my Cryfield Eldar as well. And I think that at this point in time, as I'm recording this, Drakari are in a very good spot, having won something like 75% of their placings in tournaments. So I'm sure that, with a bit of finagling, he can get that Drakari force really dangerous on the table. And finally, among our adult friends, we have our friend Brian. Brian has been playing 40k since the 90s, like most of us. He only owns two armies. He owns a Black Templars army and a Drakari army. And he's only brought the Black Templars to the table during 8th and 9th edition. The Drakari hasn't really seen use since he was playing it back in the mid 2000s. Uh, I guess Brian's main issue is that he has a force of older miniatures, like most of his miniatures are lead, and he doesn't have a lot of the new stuff. We did actually, he and I did split one of the Command Edition Ninth Edition boxes, so he has now got things like the Blade Guard and the new characters that were in the Indominus box, although not yet painted up. And Brian, of course, is one of those people who likes to only bring painted models to the table. So he's quite limited in what he can bring to the table. And unfortunately, that's meant of the games he's played so far, he's yet to get a single win. That being said, I will say that Brian is one of my favourite players to play with because no matter how badly things go for him, he's just having fun. He's just there to play the game and enjoy the game. He doesn't mind if he wins or loses. He doesn't get upset when he rolls poorly. He just enjoys being with his friends and playing a game. And that's a really great person to have in your gaming group. And finally, I'll mention here as well my son Alex and his friend Josh, both of which have had one game officially in our campaign. Alex beating Josh. Uh, they have expressed interest in playing more with the rest of us, but for a lot of the adults in the group, we sort of feel that either you win and you beat a child, and that child may lose it because they didn't want to lose, or you lose and you've just been beaten by a child. So we'll see if Alex or Josh get their armies on the table with us. Alex certainly wants to play a lot more, and he's been quite keen. He started painting his Blood Angels now as well, so I've been helping him learn to do that. So, having played 37 games of Crusade, there's certainly some consistencies that we've learned here. First off, the whole parallel element really changes the effectiveness of some units. So, as I mentioned before, most units, regardless of whether they've got the most optimal loadout possible or the worst loadout possible, have the same power level. So if you think about a tactical squad, for example, a normal tactical squad of 10 men, which I believe is 10 power level, would normally come with bolters, bolt pistols, and close combat weapons, or just bolt guns and bolt pistols. And one man can be given a special weapon, one man can be given a heavy weapon, the sergeant can use sergeant weapons, and normally as you choose those things, the points level of that unit goes up. In a power level game, no matter what you give them, whether you give those guys a special weapons, lead them with bolt guns, the power level stays the same. So in most cases, if you're playing by power level, there is no reason not to optimally load each unit. So if I'm going to put a group of Chaos Terminators on the table, I may as well give them all combi plasmas, and then Mark of Slanesh, so I can use uh, Devastating Cacophony, or their fire twice stratagem, or now with a new, actually they've got melter guns, not multi melters. In any case, there's no reason why I wouldn't give them all something more than just combi bolters because it's the same point level regardless. Now, not every unit has that advantage. A lot of units, especially character units, have a fixed loadout. So if I take, for example, a Primaris Librarian, he's going to come with a Force Sword and a Bolt Pistol, and I can't change that. So his power level is fixed. And some units, you can make up really ridiculous combinations of points-based items for the same power level. So a good example would be Eldar tanks. There's no reason why I wouldn't take Vectored Engines and Spirit Stones and vector thrust and star engines. All these things that make them better because they all cost points normally, but no impact on the power level. So normally speaking, you can estimate that roughly 20 points is one power level. Uh, some units vary up and down from that. So some units only work out at like 16 points per power level. Some you can get as high as 42, I've seen. So the power level isn't always completely balanced. But I think for the games we play, we find it works well enough. Secondly, in our 25 power level games, which is most of what we played, we did find that Psychers, and anything really that generates mortal wounds, has a really big balance swing on the game. So once, we had players who were bringing one, sometimes even two Psychers to the field. Like Mike's Death Guard, he'd have both a Chaos Sorcerer in Terminator armor and also a Demon Prince of Nurgle, and have a lot of psychic powers on the table. Even just two Smites can pump out 2d3, or possibly a d3 and a d6 mortal wounds every turn. And when you're playing a 25 power level, especially with more elite armies like Marines, you've only got a handful of wounds on the table. Now, they might be resilient, but of course, resilience doesn't have any real effect on mortal wounds in many cases. So I certainly found that in later games, I did a lot better when I made sure I either included a Psyker or something that was decidedly anti-Psyker, or I just made sure my forces ganked the wizard straight away in the first turn where I could. And that was definitely a learning point. I think a lot of us still have yet to really work out other things to get around the mortal wound attrition of your units in a low power level game. Then there is the way that Crusade balances itself. Because as your units improve during Crusade, they get abilities that they wouldn't normally have in match play on the tabletop. So they might go from being a 3+ ballistic skill to a 2+ ballistic skill. And every time they get an upgrade, they gain what's called Crusade points. When you play a game of Crusade, both factions total up the Crusade points they've got on the table. And whatever the difference is, the person with the lower Crusade points gets half that as additional command points for the game. So that's how it tries to make sure that if one person's played 10 games and has won 6 and has got all these upgrades, other person's only playing their second game, that they try to balance it out. It does work in theory, and it has worked relatively well for us up until a point. But we're now getting to the point where, as we bring new Crusade lists to the table, because people still want to keep making up new ones for reasons I'll go into in a moment, that the higher Crusade pointed armies really have an unfair advantage. So in a recent game, I was playing my Necrons versus Mike's Death Guard, and I think he had something like 23 Crusade points to my 3. So I ended up getting an additional 10 command points. And I just couldn't spend those command points in the 5 turns I had because at the low power level of game, it meant that I didn't have a lot of the units required to use certain stratagems. And yeah, sure, I could pretty much. It got to the point in later turns, I was just re-rolling for the sake of re-rolling just to burn up command points because I couldn't use them fast enough. So in that case, I don't think I got the bang for having the extra 10 command points versus the difficulty of fighting Mike's units, which had all these extra upgrades, which made them, more resilient, do more damage, move further, cap objectives better. It just didn't really balance out well. So Mike actually observed after that game that we both agreed that when we play games in the Crusade campaign going forward, we need to make sure the two armies aren't vastly different when it comes to Crusade points. And in fact, Mike was also talking about potentially retiring that Death Guard list and starting a fresh one, mainly because that original list he did start before the Death Guard Codex came out, and so he wants to optimize it a bit and maybe start again from scratch. There's always the risk as well that FAQs can screw with your list. Certainly, I mean, I started my Imperial Fist right at the start of 9th, and then the FAQ came out, or actually even just the Space Marine Codex came out and changed up a few things. So previously, I had a squad of intercessors in my army, which I decided to paint as veteran intercessors. And in the previous Marine Codex, veteran intercessors was a stratagem you could use to upgrade a unit from regular intercessors to veteran intercessors. There is a Crusade requisition you can choose that allows you to take an upgrade stratagem permanently for a unit. So initially, I had my regular intercessors, who are a troops unit, with a requisition upgrade to upgrade them to veteran intercessors, which was still a troops unit because that wasn't a different unit then. And then subsequently, there was a change in the Space Marine Codex, which meant that veteran intercessors were now a whole separate unit that cost one power level extra and were now elites. So my original army list of using that group as a troops detachment or troop slot was now broken, and I had to go and rework my list a bit. So, and that's always the risk with 40Ks. If you're using what feels the most broken, expect it to get changed during FAQs as well. So we've certainly found as new codexes came out, we've had to sit down and rework our armies, but we've always found ways to do that and agree on what's going on. And the last thing I want to say was that we have played between the core book, the Beyond the Veil book as well, and now also the new Warzone Caradon book with the Death Guard flavor. Uh, the Beyond the Veil book has some special things, some special strategic setbacks that change certain rules about the game. And that initial roll for that random trait can literally screw an army from the very beginning. So someone might come to the table with a high mobility, melee focused army, and suddenly they roll the thing, and now you've got -1 strength on all units, and your enemy who's a gun line doesn't care because it only affects their melee strength. So it can really neuter whole armies if you roll poorly on that table, or ones that slow units down for like a very mobile army as well. So it actually got to the point where uh, I didn't mind so much, but other players in our group said we simply don't want to play missions from Beyond the Veil anymore. And the new Warzone Caradon book doesn't have those sort of strategic setbacks. It's got a different thing with special stratagems that you can use in those missions, which everyone seems to be happy with. The other thing I'll point out as well, just talking about the different factions in our Crusade force, we don't have a lot of what I will call guard equivalent units. So units where the main troops are, toughness 3, 1 wound, 5+ save. Yep, Mike's got his Tyranids where they have got like Gaunts, for example, but his Tyranid army is quite monster heavy. I suppose Steve has got his Drukhari, but what they lose in their general toughness resilience, they make up for in their invulnerable saves and their mobility. So when thinking about bringing new Crusade armies to the table, I try to think about more like the Marine equivalent or Terminator equivalent when it comes to what I'm actually going to be going after. So why start a new Crusade force? And I've just shown here, this as an example is my painted up Imperial Fist force. When I originally started that force, it was because I wanted to do something new. I wanted a new project. I thought, let's do a full Primaris army. And likewise, I like a bit of variety. I actually collect most factions in 40k. I think if I take Marines as just one big faction, then I'd say the only factions I don't collect right now are Orcs and genes or Tyranids, and I've got a few genes to the cults that came with other box sets, but I've never actually put them on the table. And my tower collection is quite small, but it still exists. But I've got multiple Marine factions. I've got Dark Angels, I've got Ultramarines, I've got Grey Knights, I've got Death Watch, I've got Imperial Fists, I've got Salamanders. Um, so I do like to mix up the variety. And also in my group, I play most of the games because most of the games happen at my house because I have the space for the game as well. So by having lots of Crusade armies, I usually, when my friends come over to play, I'll say, hey, which of my armies would you like to play today? And I'll let them choose, which one I bring to the table so they can test their army against whichever one they most want to try and do. But overall, I wanted to once again create a new army from scratch. Imperial Fists I created from scratch on a whim to do a Primaris army, but I haven't yet created an army from the ground up focused on Crusade. So the new army I'm going to start is going to be specifically for this Crusade campaign, and it's going to be starting from from no models, nothing in my collection, nothing I've ever played before, starting out something entirely new. And I thought, if we're going to do this, why not share it with others? I've been more involved in Twitch streaming and putting content on YouTube in recent months. So I thought, why not make a recording and also put it up for the general public to consume if they're interested as well. So, what am I doing? What is my new Crusade force? It is Space Wolves. It's a faction I've never really considered doing in the past. And if you followed my works before, like my podcast, you'd probably know that I throw a lot of shade on Space Wolves. I really give them a hard time, and I really have never liked Space Wolves, probably for two main reasons. The first one is that for a long while, I was terrible at painting flesh. And most Space Wolves are usually shown unhelmeted. It's one of the reasons I actually liked Ultramarines is because most Ultramarine models are helmeted or can be helmeted, so I can do away with the whole painting flesh thing. Um, I've gotten a lot better now. I'm happy with my flesh painting now, and so that one's done away with. And also, I think that I didn't like Space Wolves for the same reason that a lot of people don't like Ultramarines. A lot of people, I think, don't like Ultramarines because they were sort of like GW's favorite for a long time. And so all the fiction and all the standard models were always Ultramarines, and a lot of people viewed them as too vanilla. But by the same token, I saw Space Wolves as a faction I felt, especially around the time I was working for Games Workshop, that GW were giving a lot of love to. And so the part of me that didn't want to conform automatically programmed myself to be anti Space Wolves because of that. More recently, as I've been going through the Horus Heresy series, I've been enjoying a lot of the Space Wolf books, especially like books like the Burning of Prospero, which is not really a Space Wolf book, it's more of a Thousand Suns book, but you do get to see the Space Wolves in it. Um, and so I thought, I like the color scheme. I would like to try paint this, and there are so many models that are distinctly for this faction that I thought, now's the time to actually pick up Space Wolves and give it a go. And you know what? It's going to really surprise my friends who I do Crusade with because they've always heard me put down Space Wolves. And for me to walk in and put a painted army on the table and surprise them with it, I just want to see what their faces, what their reaction is like. Um, so once again, I'm literally starting from nothing. When I say that, I have I bought, for example, Tooth and Claw, which was I think the Tooth and Claw was Space Wolves versus Gene Stealers. And so I had things like that came with the Space Wolves Lieutenant, which I actually converted into a Death Watch Lieutenant. And it came with things like the Primaris upgrade sprues, but I've never actually built them as Space Wolves. Literally, the only Space Wolves in my collection are a couple of my Death Watch Marines, which have Space Wolves shoulder pads on. Uh, also, Space Wolves is one of the factions where, at the time of recording this, their codex is already out for 9th edition. So it's already got their specific Crusade rules, their things that are interesting, like their deeds. And so I thought it's going to be something I would like to put in with a faction which is fully realized with 9th edition rules. Probably when the Adeptus Sororitas Codex comes out in a few months, I'll dive back into that faction. But for now, I'm going to put my focus into bringing this new faction to the table. And also, I'll just say that I mean, I want to build an army which is more fluffy than rules exploity. I prefer narrative armies, but I will say that melee focused armies, especially mobile melee focused armies, are doing very well in Knights because they can just take the center field, bully their opponents on objectives, and score points early. There's been so many games in our Crusade campaign that I've won either having been tabled or with like one or two models left on the board because I was able to get to the middle of the board at the start, take the objectives, and score an insurmountable lead that my opponent just could not claw back, even after wiping out most of, if not all of, my army. So, what are the restrictions and goals that I've got either because of our Crusade rules or because of my own rules when it comes to building this army? First off, as I said before, it's got to be a total 50 power level list, although I could increase that with my 5 acquisition points, but let's focus on the 50 power level for now. And I want to be able to run it as different 25 power level armies. So that means especially focusing on patrols, having at least 2 HQs, at least 2 troops choices. That way I can vary up the army. I'm not just going in there with the same army every time, and I can just put behind that a group of interesting units I want to use as well. In our own Crusade campaign, we have a blanket rule on no named characters. Obviously, you can name your own characters, but we're talking no Guilliman, no Eldrad Ulthrin, no Farseer, not Farseer, sorry, no Commander Shadow Sun. So yeah, we just focused on bringing our own heroes to the table and creating their stories rather than bringing out the heroes that are already established. And they're less interesting because they can't get XP, so they can't develop. They're just a known quantity on the table, which doesn't really progress as the game progresses. Now, also, I really don't like working with resin. I don't like resin almost as much as I don't like metal. I do have a few Forge World models in my various armies. I've got a Sakaran with my Imperial Fists. I've got a Racier with my Craft Worlds. But where possible, I want to avoid resin, especially the GW resin models that come from the stores rather than from Forge World. So these are things like a lot of the older, like the Rune Priest model for Space Wolves, and some of the older sets that are not plastic models. If I have to, like if the unit's really good, I'll do it. I will deal with it. But I'm just going to try and avoid using those for now until I develop this a bit further. I really want to focus on putting in models that are like iconically Space Wolves and really capture their aesthetic. So I don't just want to put in a bunch of Primaris Marines without the Space Wolf look and say, hey, I'm using the Space Wolf rules. I want to use Long Fangs. I want to use Grey Hunters. I want to use Thunderwolf Cavalry because they are iconically Space Wolves. And because of that, I will more than likely focus on more Firstborn Marines than Primaris. I think there will be some Primaris in the army, and I'm certainly going to do that at the start. But I will focus more on the Firstborn Marines, and I will convert where I can to make each model look more Space Wolf-like as well, because I want to make sure that that aesthetic is on the table. So I tried to work out what are some units I'd really like to get into the Space Wolf list at some point. I mentioned before that psychic powers and mortal wounds are a huge boon, so I'd love to get in a psyker, i.e. a librarian, which is a rune priest, although they don't really have a rune priest data sheet anymore. Likewise, if I can get some sort of anti-psyker ability in there for when I don't choose to run with the psyker, so something like Hounds of Morkai, which have their ability to really screw with psykers. Um, if it's going to be Space Wolves, there's got to be something that's got some devastating melee. And for me, Wolfen can't be beat on just the damage they do in melee. It is ridiculous. And so I'd love to get some Wolfen in there. When it comes to, I can't completely forsake shooting. So I would like to get a unit of Long Fangs into the army because Devastators are just doing quite well in the game in general at the moment. So get some Long Fangs in there. I'd love to use at least one or not more of the iconic Space Wolf Dreadnoughts, like the Wolfen Dreadnoughts. Obviously, can't use Murderfang because it's a named character, but there are other options for Space Wolf Dreadnoughts. And finally, I do like the Flyer. Unfortunately, the Space Wolf Flyer at a point power level game is very expensive. It's the same cost, if not, it's actually more than a Land Raider. And Flyers have struggled in 9th edition because their inability to do anything regarding objectives. So I think that it'll be a while before I bring one of these Flyers into my list. But I do like the model and would love to get one in my army. And I do have Flyers in my other lists as well. So starting off with troops, I focused on two I wanted to go with. First off, I did want an iconic Space Wolf unit, so I've gone for some Blood Claws. Starting off with just 5 models. I do prefer in Crusade to start with the smaller forces and then increase their size. So they all come with chainswords and bolt pistols by standard. At 5 models, they can have one special weapon. I'm undecided yet whether I want to take away one of the chainswords to give them a combi weapon. Probably something like a combi grav, given that most of my opponents are going to be using uh, Marine and Terminator equivalents. One model can also have a plasma pistol, which is probably a no-brainer to swap a bolt pistol plasma pistol. Once again, using power level, not points. There's no cost to that. And finally, the pack leader can have a power axe, power fist, or power sword. I will probably go with a power fist once again because it's better against the mech and tech opponents as well. Now, Blood Claws do get Berserk Charge, which also gives an additional attack on a charge, in addition to the attack for Shock Assault. So they can put out pretty big damage in melee. That doesn't apply if they get charged into, so they do get Shock Assault if they are the target of a charge, but they only get the additional one for Berserk Charge if they actually charge as well. Although they are limited by their Headstrong trait, which means that when they are declaring a charge, they must include the closest unit as one of the targets for that charge. So you can sort of kite them around if you don't want to be charged by, with certain units. You've got to just put a unit on the other side of them a bit closer, and they have to charge the closer unit. And then for a second troops choice to do some variants, I figured I want to go with another melee focus because that's really what Space Wolves are about. So I thought I'll whack in some assault intercessors. They're 5 power level for 5 models. Once again, chainsaws and bolt pistols. There are limited additional options, so the sergeants can swap their bolt pistol for a hand flame or plasma pistol, which why wouldn't you in this case? And can also swap their power fist for, so can also swap their chainsword for a power fist, power sword, or thunderhammer. I really like giving Space Wolves Thunderhammers, not just because they look thematically great, but because their trait of +1 to hit when they charge means that you're going to be hitting with Thunderhammers on 3s for most units and 2s with characters, which is great for a Thunderhammer, especially with that flat 3 damage. It really takes some of the wind out of Terminators, although unfortunately not Death Guard Terminators who still have their -1 damage. Then I got to think of what I want to put into HQ. And once again, I wanted to have 2 troops and 2 HQs. For my first troop, I've never really had a Smash Captain in any of my Marine armies because most of my, or pretty much all my Marine armies have been more shooting focused. So I've decided to go with a Smash Captain here, just a captain with jump pack because you can customize the gear a lot more than Primaris captains. So in this case, Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. I'll give him the Hunter Warlord trait, which is +1 to advance and charge rolls, and he can also charge after advancing. And once he's charged once, he gets his deed off, which means that units within 6 inches of him can also charge after advancing as well. I did consider giving him the Warlord trait, which means that when he gets Shock Assault, he gets D3 extra attack instead of 1, but I would rather guarantee he gets in. Using the weapons he's got, he would kill in melee 4 guard equivalent, 3.5 Marines, almost 3 Terminators, and put over 6 wounds on a toughness 8 vehicle, which isn't that ridiculous these days. Like if I compare that with a Succubus, which is like half the power level, with the right weapons, can easily one shot a Lehman Russ. So he's not too broken, but thematically, I just wanted to have a Space Wolf character flying around with a jump pack. And to make him more survivable, along with the Storm Shield, I'm going to give him Pelt of the Beowulf, which means that when he is in melee, all attacks against him are -1 to hit and -1 to wound. So that'll really help him stay alive. And then for a second HQ, as I mentioned, I wanted the Librarian. This was a tough choice to go with just a Librarian because for 5 power level, I could have had a Primaris Librarian or a Librarian in Phobos armor, either of which gets more attacks for the same power level. But I'm going to go with the standard Librarian only because I don't want to buy the Resin Rune Priest model. And I feel like the easiest model to convert will be the standard Marine Librarian model, which comes with a Force Stave. I will try and convert it. I would really like to give them a combi weapon because they can have that, which means that they'll have better shooting than I would get with a Primaris equivalent. To make up for the lost attack. And then in terms of psychic powers, I'm going to give them Instincts Awoken, which allows them to put a unit into the Assault Doctrine. If the whole army is already in Assault Doctrine, then it allows them to give that unit an additional -1 AP on 6s to hit, which does stack with the Assault Doctrine benefit as well. And then I'll give them also Living Lightning, which is like another version of Smite. It does D3 wounds to the closest unit within 18 inches, but then you roll a dice on a 2+, it arcs to another unit doing 1 mortal wound. On a 5+, it does an additional D3 mortal wounds. So I think just for getting out additional damage, and as I said, mortal wounds is really powerful in low power level games, so that's what I've gone for. So what else did I want to put in there? That took up a total of 22 power level, leaving me another 28 to do everything else. So I definitely wanted to add in Longfangs and Wolven at 7 and 8 power level each, bringing me down to 13 power level. I then thought, what else did I want? I liked the idea of using some Firstborn bike squads because they also get the Berserk charge rule for Space Wolves, meaning they also get to have the extra attack when they do charge. So giving them chainswords, they can actually be quite effective in melee as well. So adding them in, and also they're good for capping objectives, left me over with 8 power level. So I decided for 8 power level, I would just throw in a Venerable Dreadnought, probably with the Storm Shield, and I'm not sure which weapon, whether I do the axe or the claws yet, but yeah, I love that model. I'm happy to pick one up, and I think that would look great on the table. And once again, really capture that Space Wolf aesthetic. So that's my 50 power level. The Captain, Librarian, Bloodclaws, Intercessors, the Bikes, Devastators, Wolfen, and the Venerable Dreadnought. So what's next? I need to start buying all this gear. So I've decided to do the Smash Captain. I'm going to buy a veteran Vanguard squad to get the jump pack and like the jumping legs. And what I'll do is I'll also pick up a Space Wolves pack box, which does 10 models, and it's only limited to 10 in terms of the legs. It's got more than 10 torsos, way more than 10 heads. So what I'm hoping is if I pick up a Devastator squad, regular Devastator squad, I can use bits from the Space Wolves pack to upgrade the Devastator squad to look like Space Wolves, to make 5 Blood Claws, and then to also use some pieces to make my Veteran Vanguard look like a Space Wolf captain, basically, or a, what are they called? Wolf Lord? Yeah, like a Wolf Lord. So I'll get the Veteran Vanguards, I'll get the regular Librarian, which to convert. I'll just pick up one of the Space Wolf conversion packs for Firstborn, and I'll also go for some Primaris upgrades as well. I'll get some Assault Intercessors, I'll get Devastators, get a Bike Squad, get Wolven, and finally get a Dreadnought. So all told, that comes to 650 roughly Australian dollars, or roughly 500 USD, or 360 pounds. I do save a bit of money. I do have some Primaris upgrades left over from Tooth and Claw. Well, I've got everything left from Tooth and Claw except for the one shoulder pad I use for my Deathwatch Marine. And also I've got some unbuilt bikes left over from the Crusade magazine, which I got from Games Workshop. So yeah, once I've got all that gear together, I will convert, kit bash, put together whatever I need, and then it's just a case of learning to paint Space Wolves. So that's it for this video. When I next come back, it'll be when I've acquired all of this stuff and I've started to put it together. So I will show you how I've gone with my conversions. I might talk a bit more about what I want to do with the Crusade list in the future once it starts to earn some more requisition points. Probably even go through what I'm going to spend the first 5 requisition points on. I've already mentioned a Warlord trait and a relic for the Warlord, but that still leaves 3 left over. There are some upgrades I could do with units at the very start. I could actually make the Venerable Dreadnought, give it a level, make a blood level at the start based upon one of the abilities, and also use the Wolf and the Lion trait to give one of my sergeants an extra attack and make one of my melee units even a bit more melee as well. So I'll think about it. I'll buy the models, I'll put them together, and I'll show you where I'm at in the next video, which could be in a week, it could be in a month. We'll have to wait and see. But hopefully this is a series you're interested in seeing, and thank you for listening to what I've done so far. I will see you next time.